So the next part is exactly about that. So how carbon certification is being framed in the European Union to serve into climate policies. So I'm going to start to say a few words about, well, I know that quite a few of you already know it quite well, so I will go quite fast, but the carbon removal certification framework. So in November 2022, the Commission made a proposal to create an EU-wide carbon removal certification framework. So the idea was, we're going to make sure that we contribute to the achievement of our LULUCF objective, our SYNC objective of 310 million tons removed in 2030. And we're going to do that by standardizing an MRV tool to be sure that these additional removals are good quality ones. So the idea is to have like a reliable, fair, efficient, and simple scheme to account for these removals. And there was also the idea right from the beginning to rely on an existing certification scheme, like, for example, the label by carbon. And to achieve these objectives, so the idea was also that using this tool to develop result-based payments for public and private finance, which is more or less what I was saying before. So to develop uses, policy designs and so on that uses result-based payment. The Commission said right from the beginning that this framework was agnostic about the uses of the certificate. They could be used for anything and everything. But what we can already say is that on the short term, it could be used for public fundings to actually feed our LULUCF objectives. Could also be used for targeted funds from the CAP. Private fundings could also rely on this carbon certification for value chain contracts, for the voluntary carbon markets. We've been talking a lot about this thing. And okay, it's not in the right column, but that's fine. But for now, what was said by the Commission is that there was no link planned between the emission trading system, so the compliance emission trading system, and the voluntary carbon certification for removals. But in the medium term, some new uses could appear for this carbon certification framework. Could be used to formulate our climate objectives for 2040. So to have better documented removal targets. Then there are also two studies that are planned to evaluate how we could include these removals into ETS. I will come back on that. And then also, how could we include in the next CAP these tools of climate impact guarantee? One major aspect of the discussion around the carbon certification framework is what are we going to certify, and especially what will be the scope for carbon farming. So the initial proposal suggested that only removals should be included and not emission reductions. But actually in the negotiations, a lot of measures that are actually emission reductions could maybe be certified. So, for example, if I take the CAP2ER methodology or carbon agri methodology, so the livestock methodology, most of the measures that it implies are emission reduction measures. They might be excluded from this carbon certification framework, or they might be included. We don't know yet. But yeah, this is one of the main point of discussion for us, because what we can see with these methodologies that you're trying to implement with live carbon farming is that you're really working on a farm as a system, and you're not like distinguishing between removals and emission reduction at the moment that you're doing and you're preparing an action plan. So we do support a vision in which carbon farming emission reductions could also be included and certified. I'm not going to go too far on that, but there are a few quality criteria, and they have been presented already at the live carbon farming event. So the quality criteria, this is actually the same criteria that I presented at the beginning. So measurable, transparent, additional, and so on. They just call it in another way about quantification, additionality, long-term storage, and sustainability. And so in theory, it's kind of the same criteria, but if we take the concrete modalities, the concrete measures for that, so they consider in the quantification that they would only measure removals, subtracting to these removals any possible increase, like a side effect of this removal action. So you should subtract any increase in greenhouse gases emissions. With this fear that I already mentioned, that this accounting scope might not be attractive for farmers. Then on additionality, it's really soft. The criteria for additionality that the Commission is putting is like really limited. It's far from what I was describing at the beginning. But still, the definition of the reference scenario is not clear. What do they ask for permanence? So what they're thinking of using are temporary credits. And this is something that has not been done since the clean development mechanism, and it didn't work well. So this is a new system that would have to be explored. And something else is that they are going to establish some liability mechanism if there are some releases of the carbon. And this has to be really thought carefully, not to put too much weight on the project holders. And the last part about co-benefits, so the initial idea is that the projects shouldn't have any negative impact on other environmental issues. Just a few words on the legislative agenda. So the proposal was in 2022. The Commission launched an expert group to work on this, on some technical aspects of this proposition. And during this autumn, so we had the adoption of the Parliament position on the text, of the Council position, and we just recently had the first trialogue meeting on it. So it's actually quite a fast process, and there is really this attempt to reach a final adoption before the legislative elections that will take place in June. Yeah, I'm not going to go too far on that because we only have 10 minutes. So, but yeah, I've already said that the scope of the mechanism is a hotspot negotiation. And there is also a point that emerged at the Parliament and at the Council about what should we require as co-benefits, especially in the climate farming spectrum. Do you have any question on this CRCF? I guess that most of you are already quite familiar with it, but I thought that could be useful to have it as a reminder. Yeah, Lorraine.
Hello. Do you have a perspective or vision of what would happen for regional carbon schemes if this European one comes into place?
Well, we don't know. Most probably, you will have the CRCF will not be ready before some time. So we can imagine that, yeah, that's not a question yet. And then we can also imagine that there will be for some time a coexisting mode between the two of them. Depending on how much the methodologies are going to overlap, depending on the prices, depending on how easy or how difficult is the MRV proposed by the Commission, that will probably make one or the other scheme more attractive. So if we do have a price at 100 euros, I guess that probably a lot of initiatives will choose to switch to one system from another, but we don't really know yet, and that's a great deal of uncertainty for the project holders for now, because they don't know what will be the value of the credits they will be able to emit in 5 years. But we don't really have the answer yet.
Saverio has a question too.
Sì, I'm sorry, but this question is not on the European regulation. I would to know where is registered the carbon credit in your scheme. There is a registry of the label base carbon.
Yeah, so we have, this is the Ministry for the Environmental Transition that has a registry. And this is it. So I guess this is mostly like an Excel table of the projects that emitted, the credits that were bought and everything. And there is a question actually during the negotiations for now about who is going to hold this registry. So, and I think that the Parliament proposition, not sure if it's the Parliament or the Council, that wanted something more or less more centralized, like the Commission would be the one to hold all the registries for the different countries. But this is an important question because it's hard to make sure that it's completely interoperable. Yeah, Mark, you might have the answer.
Yes, you said rightfully that in the framework there is no details about the uses, but when you hear the different discussions, you see clear that there is a tendency to close or to not use, in fact, the certificates issued by the framework for offsetting. If this is the case, offsetters, to what I hear, offsetters are ready to pay more for the same credit as insetters. Are we then not killing from the start the initiative? So is the first question, is this the same? Do you have the same opinion? And secondly, what about the willingness of offsetters to pay more than insetters?
Yeah. So yeah, that's true that the Parliament in its position report said that the credits shouldn't, that accordingly with the Empowering Consumers Directive, the credits shouldn't be used for offsetting purpose for products, and they added for organizations, but this is not what the Empowering Consumers Directive says. So I guess there is a confusion in the report from the Parliament on that. The thing is that we're probably going in a phase that offsetting claim is being phased out, and we're turning to contribution claims, which seems to make everyone happy. So I'm okay with that, even though I don't think that changes much thing. But so I wouldn't consider in like offsetting or insetting, but like first voluntary markets are going to switch to contribution. But then on the offsetting part, this is my next part about the studies that Ecologic and Trinomics just published on the possible use of carbon certificates within the agri value chain. So I guess next part is going to answer your question. Okay, so I'm going to go to, I promise this is the last part. But that might also be the most complicated. Yeah, so I have been talking about the carbon certification framework for removals, which is what I call here on this slide the carrot part. So the idea is that you do compensate farmers or foresters for the environmental services of carbon removal with this specific scope of removals that we've been talking about. There is a second part of the European policy that is starting to be designed. It's only preliminary studies that have been published so far, which would be more like a stick policy. And this idea would be to introduce a polluter pays principle on agricultural emissions, so on methane and nitrous oxide emissions. And this polluter pays principle, they want to introduce it through an ETS, which means that we might be heading towards a third ETS, this time on agricultural emissions. And there is a policy design with this carrot and stick features that the ETS revenues, so the money that would be raised by sanctioning the agricultural emissions, would pay for the removals that would be then incentivized on the other way. So how does it work? So where does it come from first? The idea comes from a report from 2021 from the European Court of Auditors that was stating how bad is the cap to fund climate mitigation. Basically, that there were few measures that incentivized really farmers to reduce their emissions, or on the contrary, they even incentivized an increase in emissions. And in this report, there were recommendations for the Commission. One of them was you should be assessing the potential to apply a polluter-based principle to emissions from agricultural activities and reward farmers for long-term carbon removals. And this is why there was a study in two parts that was commissioned by the European Commission on this potential to apply a polluter-based principle. And there was a strong bias in this demand that all the options of polluter-based principles that were analyzed were emission trading system. So we have an analysis of 5 different possible agricultural emission trading systems. So it just gave birth to a publication that was just recently published by Trinomics, EOP, Ecologic Institute, and so on. So they published a study assessing different configurations of an ag ETS. This is its little name. And then how this ag ETS could finance long-term removals. And so just in a few words, what are the options that were analyzed? So there were 5 options of ag ETS that were proposed, and they had different scopes and different impacts. So there are 3 on-farm ETS options, 1 upstream, 1 downstream. So first option would be to take the farmers as the obligated parties. So the farmers will be the one to be allocated allowances of emissions and to be able to trade them, reduce them, and so on. This would be an enormous ETS. And the report made a few estimates on how many farmers could be in. They used some threshold and so on. And the final number they reached was 700,000 farms that could be in an ETS. This is enormous. Just to give you an idea, the ETS 1 on energy and so on, this is 11,000 installations. Yeah, we're quite far. And the second option, still on farm, is to consider only the livestock farming. That this is more limited. Also, this is a lot of farms also. And the last option is only to look at peatlands, so farmers that are cultivating on drained peatlands. And this will be a lot more reduced also. And then the upstream and downstream option, one option, upstream option, the obligated parties would be the manufacturers or the importers of fertilizers and feeds, animal feeds. And then what they call the downstream ETS would be that you put the point of obligation on the first processing of livestock. So there would be meat, so the slaughterhouses, and for milk, that would be the dairies. And obviously, these two last options would have a lot less obligated parties. Other options that are considered are combining different ETS. So there might be like a bit of upstreaming with downstreaming and so on. And just for you to understand what kind of incentives does it give, well, if the obligated party is the farmer itself, well, effectively to emit less greenhouse gases, it could change its use of fertilizers. It's herd, the number of livestock it has. It can adopt some on-farm practices to reduce to reduce, for example, nitrous oxide emissions by reducing fertilizers, and so on and so on. But it could also just reflect this prices of emissions into the agricultural commodities that it's going to sell, obviously. Then, if we are talking about the manufacturers and importers of fertilizers and feed, what they could do is change their products so that they will be low-emitting feed and fertilizers. And probably they're also going to put this higher price on the farmers, which means that the farmers will have a higher price fertilizers and will maybe choose to switch to some other fertilization modalities. For the downstream option, it means that slaughterhouses and dairies, well, actually, mostly, I mean, they don't have really any impacts on what's happening before. So what they could do is like make the agro-industries that are after them in the value chain paying more money for the products, and later on the value chain, they can also choose to use less animal products. So you can see that in the upstream and downstream options, obviously the incentive to reduce is more indirect. So what they introduced in this study is actually that there might be some incentives which would take the form of carbon credits in order for the farmers to have an incentive to change their practice. So in the on-farm ETS, there could be an option for the non-obligated farmers to actually participate in this market and sell on-farm certified voluntary credits to the ones that are obligated if they don't manage to decrease their emissions. And on the upstream and downstream approach, there is this idea to facilitate some vertical arrangements. So we're back to this insetting notion, with the idea that the manufacturers of fertilizers and feeds or downstream of the agro-industry, they could help to finance the change in practices on farm through the payments of carbon credits. So we're seeing this carbon credits features coming back in all the options. First, in terms of tools, because obviously to settle such an ag ETS, you would need a greenhouse gas reporting tool that is harmonized for the whole European Union. There is also the introduction of, so the idea is that we would mostly use default values at the beginning at least, but then we would, to be more precise about the emissions, there would be the possibility to use certified methods that would probably use a lot of tools that the carbon certification uses. And then you really have some MRV methodologies that could be introduced with this certified on-farm voluntary credits if they were to be introduced. Just a few words on that. We're already late, but these are my last slides. They have made this assessment on the 5 options. And what we can see is that really the most complex options are the on-farm ones. But at the same time, the easiest ones, so the upstream and downstream, they don't really provide any direct incentive for mitigation on farms. So either we do something that is easy to implement, or we do something that is more efficient on the incentive. So yeah, well, all these options, they do require a harmonized greenhouse gas reporting tool. I said that, and they do also require to provide for some aid for the farmers to actually transform their practices. So what goes with it is like really new schemes to actually support the transition, and these schemes could be built through the CAP, which is not the case so far. Last but not least, the second part of the study explores some options that could link this ag ETS to the CRCF. So this idea of taking the money from the polluters to reward the removers. And there are a few options that have been analyzed, some that are completely what they call disconnected markets. So you would take the revenues on one side, and then the government would choose in the way it wants to give it for removals. And you have two other options that are more integrated, a lot more risks also, that put directly face-to-face agricultural emissions and carbon removals. So these are the two on the right, which would mean that with the government in between or not, but the obligated parties in the ETS, in the agricultural ETS, would be able to directly buy allowances, carbon credits for removals from the CRCF. So in this case, it definitely becomes a compliance scheme. So from what was a voluntary use and uses as open as possible, it could become something a lot more regulatory. Here it is. Yeah. Sorry for the time. Do you have any questions on this ag ETS and on the possible architectures could have? No questions? Well, anyway, I invite you really to have a look at this, these reports that have been produced. This is bit hard to read everything, but this is really interesting to have a perspective on how the CRCF could be used in a regulatory way. And if you have questions, I read it, so so don't hesitate. Well, that was my last part, so I hope that was useful for you, these presentations.
Yes, Donald.
Yeah, I have another question there, but it's not really about the Ag ETS. It's more about something I was just reading there about the low carbon label. It was saying that it doesn't guarantee reductions in carbon emissions, that it's based on projections and that the emissions can increase even with this label. I just wanted to know if that's correct. I just came across it on the internet.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so I think I know what you might reference. The principle of the carbon certification is that you do compare a reference scenario to your project scenario. So
that's the counterfactual.
in absolute terms, you could say that in theory, you could eventually have a scenario of project that increases emissions, but it means that the business as usual scenario would increase even more the emissions. But I don't think it's happening at all. But what happens is that for the crop fill methodology, so for the everything that is, so the cover crops, introducing legumes and so on, usually we are talking about a scenario that is a net emitter at the beginning, which is true for the whole of Europe. Most of the mineral agricultural soil are net emitters. And it's true that at the end of the project, I mean, for the project that have been made now, most of the projects, they remain emitter. There are a lot less emitters. So they really decrease the emission, but they're still not removers, not net removers. So I know this was a question in the European negotiations, because everyone was seeing this thing about soil carbon as a possibility to include into removals. But in the end, it's not removals, we're just decreasing emissions, but that's already something. So to my knowledge, there is no projects that are increasing emissions, but it's true that with this crop field methodology, we're still not there to talk about net removals. We're still about decreasing emissions.
All right, thanks. Thank you.
Well, you're welcome. So I know that was a bit long. I hope that anyway, the presentation was registered and you can go back to it, and that will be made public indeed.
Yes, and so if you allow me, Clotilde, I will send the presentation to all the participants, so you have the PDF of the slides.
Yeah, definitely. I'm going to send it to you. And anyway, if you do have the occasion to read this last study I've been talking about, I'm really keen to know what's your opinion on the different options, and if it does raise some concerns from your respective countries, and also because it's really hard to see the whole picture only with this on paper options.
Yes, maybe something to discuss to the next monthly meeting of the Live Carbon Farming Project.
Could be.
Well, thank you very much, Clotilde. It was very, very interesting for us to know more about this topic and to have some updates too on the European law, for example, the European regulation. So thank you very much for these very fruitful exchanges and for this insight on the basics of climate economics.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for your questions. Hope that was useful. Thank you. Well, I'll see you at the next meetings then from our respective projects.
Thank you.
Thank you.